Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Nun Zayin, like many of the Dafim in Masechtas Eruvin, is quite a mathematical Daf. There is one Mishnah in the first part of the Daf, and the Daf also ends with a Mishnah. So from the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnah is in the middle of a discussion about the space around the city which is provided as the tchum of the city. We're not here referring to the regular tchumin, we're referring to the halacha that there should be a strip around the city of unused land to beautify the city. The Gemara is in the middle of a discussion as to how much that land is relative to the general tchumin of the city. We had seen one pshat, and we're going to see three more about the ratios there. Then the Gemara will question the ratios of squares to circles and how much their respective areas are and how much their respective diameters are equal to relative to their diagonals. Then we get to the Mishnah. The Mishnah will open the subject of the karfeif of a city. That is, every city, when calculating its borders for tchumin, is given a karfeif surrounding the city, and the question will be one karfeif per city, or two karfeifin if there's two cities near each other, or possibly even if you have three cities laid out near each other, how many karfeifin do you get? And the Gemara will discuss that. So first of all, let's begin. The halacha is the psukim spell out regarding the cities of the Levium. Levium were given 48 cities in Eretz Yisrael. Each city had around it 1,000 amma wide belt, which was meant to be left empty. It was just blank land that was used to beautify the city. And then around that there was another 1,000 amma wide belt, and that was for vineyards and fields. So you have two strips of 1,000 amma surrounding the city. The closer one is empty, the further one is fields. And we had seen a brisa that says that the strip surrounding the city is 1/4. The space that's left empty for noi, that's 1/4. So the Gemara had asked, it's not 1/4, it's half. If that's 1,000 amma wide and the one around it is 1,000 amma wide, so it's half. So how are you saying that it's 1/4? So we had seen one pshat explaining what is meant by it's 1/4. Now we're going to get three more pshat explaining what is meant by 1/4. So the first answer that we will see in our daf is brought by Abaya. Abaya says, again, let's count how many 1,000 amma by 1,000 amma squares are there surrounding the city. So the city itself is 1,000 ammas by 1,000 ammas. 2 layers deep, 2 circles, 2 squares surrounding the city, each one 1,000 ammas wide. It gives us how many precisely. So the first layer surrounding the city itself is 8 squares of 1,000 ammas by 1,000 amma, and then the next layer around that is another 16 squares, 1,000 ammas by 1,000 ammas to get all the way around, for a total of 24 squares of 1,000 ammas by 1,000 ammas. And the one that goes around, the first layer, the layer which is empty, is 8. So 8 is 1/4 of 24. So the Gemara says 8 is not 1/4 of 24, 8 is the third of 24. The Gemara says, yes, that is correct if it would be square. But here we're talking about where it's a circle. So because it's a circle, the circle is 1/4 less than the square, and therefore it's a circular city with a circular strip going around it, and therefore it's only a total of 6. It's equal to the area of 6,000 amma squares, and 6 is 1/4 of 24, and that's why it works out. So that's a bias pshat. Ravina has a different shot. Ravina says we're actually not referring to the strip going all the way around. We're talking only about the part which is right next to the city itself on the sides. We're not counting the corners. When the Torah said to leave an empty strip, it was only talking about the sides. And we're referring to a city which is 2,000 ammas by 2,000 ammas. So the city itself, 2,000 ammas by 2,000 ammas, the amount of squares going all the way around the city, 2 layers deep, is 32 total squares. And the sides, since it's 2,000 ammas by 2,000 ammas, you have 2 on each side for a total of 8. 8 is 1/4 of 32. That is what the Mishnah means by 32. Rav Ashi says, actually, we're referring to the corners. When the Torah said leave empty spaces, it was just talking about the corners. Now, it's a 2,000 amma by 2,000 amma city, and the corners, each corner is a space of 2,000 ammas by 2,000 ammas. That's what you have off of each corner. Of those corners, 1/4 of them is the empty space. because the corners right near the corners of the city, that is what's left empty. The other 3 squares within the corners are each used for field. Again, in each corner you have 4 squares. One of those squares is empty, and 3 of those squares, the outer 3 squares, are used for vineyards, and therefore the actual space is 1/4 that's used for vineyards. So now the Gemara says, but what do you mean? How can you say that it's just the corners? The Torah's description uses the word saviv, going around. Going around means it should be a belt going all the way around. How can you tell me just the corners? So the Gemara says just corners is also called going around, like we see when you describe the blood that's put on the mizbeach. It says you should put v'zarku b'nei harnes hadam al mizbeach saviv. They should put it around, but it's not put around, it's only put on the corners. So you see, just the corners is also called going around. Okay, now the Gemara asks that we had seen earlier that the explanation of Abaye that we saw today, and the explanation of Rava, which was on the daf previous, said that we're referring to a circular city. So the Gemara says, how could it be circular, and the strip that goes around it is also a circle? The middle city, the city will cut in, the corners of the city will cut into the circle going around it. How could you have a circular strip going around? So the Gemara says, what do you mean? We said we're referring to where the city itself was a circle. The Gemara said, yeah, but we know that the halacha is that you're supposed to square off the circle. When you measure the borders, you square it off. The Gemara says, yeah, when you measure the borders, you square it off. You don't actually square off the city. The city, you don't build houses. The city itself is still round. So as far as calculating the empty space that goes around, the empty space is a circular strip. You don't not view it as part of the circular strip just because it's empty. Because you have to square it off to measure the borders, doesn't mean that it's not empty space anymore. It's still empty space, and therefore it counts as part of the strip that goes around. Okay, now the Gemara asks on the math over here. We had said earlier that when you square off a city, so you end up adding to the borders of the city, to the space of the city, you add 400 amos. So if the city itself is a circular with a diameter of 2,000 amos, when you square it off, so you're going to go to the corners, your new corner that you're making is going to be 400 amos from the edge of the circle, so you're adding 400 amos space. So the rest it shouldn't be that way. We know that the relationship between a circle that's set in a square and the square itself is 1/3. The circle is 1/3 smaller than the square. That means that when you square off the city, you should be adding 1/3. So if the city itself was 2,000 amos by 2,000 amos circle, it was a circle with a diameter of 2,000 amos. When you're squaring it off, you should be adding to get to the corner 1/3 of 2,000. 1/3 of 2,000 is 666 and 2/3. That should be the additional length. That way, 1/3 of the circle is what is added to get to the square. That means that the square itself is actually 1/4 of the square, which is equal to 1/3 of the circle. That's how much a square is larger than the circle. So why are you saying that you're adding 400 amos when you square it off and you add that space from the edge of the circle to the corner? It's not really 400 amos. It should be 666 and 2/3. The Gemara says no. You're getting confused over here. When we say that a circle is larger, a circle is smaller than a square that it's set into by 1/3, we're talking about area. The area of the circle is 1/3 of the circle smaller than the square, and the area of the square is 1/4 of the square larger than the circle. Those two things are correct. But here we're not talking about area. We're talking about if you extend the diameter of the circle into the corner of the square that's surrounding it. That's not a third. That is 1.4. It is 2/5 larger. And therefore, if the diameter of the circle is 2,000 amos, 2/5 of 2,000 is 400, to get from the edge of the circle, extending the diameter of the circle through the edge all the way into the corner of the square that I'm now using to square off the circle, that'll add another 400 amos. Okay, this ends the Gemara. Now we get to the next mission, which is discusses the halachas of the karfef, which is added around the city. As you will recall, a karfef is 5,000 square amos. Now, 5,000 square amos, if there's one area that's 5,000 square amos, that's an exact square. The area itself would have lengths that are 70 and 2/3 amos by 70 and 2/3 amos. That's what would be the length of the size of a square that is 5,000 square amos exactly. Now, therefore, a karfef, which is 5,000 square amos, we view the width of a karfef as being 70 and 2/3 amos. So the halacha is that when we measure the city, according to some opinions, we add a space from the actual edge of the city of one karfef, which is 70 and 2/3 amos, to the borders of the city, and we only start measuring the tchum after that. So the Mishnah begins and says that is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says every time you measure a city, you start counting the tchum 70 and 2/3 amos from the actual edge of the city. Now the Chachamim say it's not true. If you have a single city by itself, there's no halacha of adding a karfif around the city. Where do we say this halacha? If you have two cities near each other, and each one, if I would add a karfif around each one, 70 and 2/3 amos around each one, and those two karfifin would touch or overlap, meaning the distance between the two cities is 141 and 2/3 amos or less, 141 and 1/3 amos or less, so that their two karfifin would rub, then I consider it to be one joint city, and I combine their tchumin and I calculate their tchumin generally around them. Now the Chachamim say the same thing applies if you have three cities that are laid out, and the Gemara will discuss how exactly they're laid out. Then I could also count 141 and 1/3 amos, and if it's that distance between them or less, I can count it as being one city. However, if you have just one city by itself, there is no halacha that you add a karfef before you start measuring the tchum. Okay, now the Gemara begins analyzing this. First of all, the Gemara wants to know what is the makar, what is the source of this halacha that you possibly add karfifin around the city, either one or two, depending if you're like Rav Meir or the Chachamim. So the Gemara says the pasuk describing the cities of the Levim says mikir ha'ir v'chutzala, from the wall of the city and outward. So you add an outward, you add a chutza, and that's this karfef of 70 and 2/3 amos, and only from there do you start counting further. Okay, so now the Gemara has a machlokes on how do you understand the Chachamim. So we saw that the Chachamim say that you only say the halacha of karfef when you have two cities near each other. So the way we explain the Mishnah, which seems to be explicit later in the Mishnah, as we shall see soon, not necessarily so, the Chachamim say that each city gets its own karfif, and therefore you have the total space between the cities can be up to two karfifin, 141 and 1/3 amos, in order to consider them connected. That is not necessarily true. That is how Rabbi Chia understands Chachamim's opinion. Rav Huna, however, says no, it's only one karfif between them. All they need to have between them is 70 and 2/3 amos. If they are that close, then they are combined. If they're any further than 70 and 2/3 amos, then it's too far and they don't combine it. So the Gemara now tries to prove from the Mishnah who is correct, Rabbi Chia or the Chachamim. So the Gemara first of all says, if you look at the language of the Mishnah, it says like Amru karfef el ben shtei ayaris. The language of the Chachamim is they didn't say the halacha of karfef except for between two cities. It sounds like one karfef. It says karfef, only one, not two. So Gemara says no, it just means the halacha of karfef, the din of karfef, but really it's two. It just spoken singular because it's referring to the concept of karfef. The Gemara says it has to be the way, because if you look later in the Mishnah, like we quoted it, it says if you have two cities with two karfifin between them, that's where you're allowed to combine them. So it's pretty clear that that you have up to two karfifin to be able to combine the city. 141 and 1/3 amos. Where it says, hold on a second, how do you know that that's a Chachamim talking? Maybe that last line is Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said even one city alone gets a karfif, so it makes sense that he would hold that two cities each get their own karfif, and you have a total of two karfifin to have them have between each other and still be able to combine them into one city as far as calculating tchumin. So Gemara says, hold on a second, but if that's Rav Meir, so Rav Meir already told us. Why would Rav Meir say that again? Why would he add that halacha? If he says by one city you get a karfif, so by two cities, for sure each one gets its own karfif and you have a total of two. So Gemara says not necessarily. Could be that I need him to tell me that one city gets a karfif and that two cities each get their own karfif, and I couldn't know one from the other. If you only told me that one city gets a karfif, maybe that's only one. But who says that two cities each get a karfif? Maybe two cities each have to share a karfif. Who says that they each get their own? And if you would have said that two cities each get two karfifin, that's because they're very close together, they're squished, and they need a lot of space. But one city by itself, who says he needs a whole karfif surrounding him? Maybe he doesn't need anything because there's a lot of room there. There's only one city alone by himself, and therefore I wouldn't know that halacha. Okay, now the Gemara wants to prove again between the machlokes of Huna and Rav Chia, if we're discussing one karfif between cities or two karfifin. The Gemara is going to go to the last case where we had three cities near each other. The exact wording of the Mishnah was that you have three cities. The Gemara is assuming initially that the three cities are all in a row. And the Mishnah says that the outer cities, the ones on the edges, are 141 and 1/3 amos from each other, meaning they are two karfifin apart. And that's when you can combine all three into one city. So the Gemara says, so you see that the only way you're allowed to combine them is if you have two karfifin between them and there's a city in between them. But if you had just two karfifin without a third city in between, that would be too far to combine. So obviously, it's a kasha on Rav Huna, who says you're allowed to have 2 full karfifin in between. It's not true. You're only allowed to have 2 full karfifin plus a city in between. But if you have just 2 cities with 2 full karfifin, that's too far. That's no good. So Rav Huna says you're misunderstanding the case altogether. We're not talking about 3 cities lined up in a row. We're talking about 3 cities that are laid out like a triangle. And what's actually happening is as follows. We view the third city, the one that's off to the side, as we lungishly place it between the 2 cities, and then I measure the distance from the 2 outer cities to the middle city, which I'm lungishly going to place between the 2 of them. And if it's 141 and a third, then we allow them all 3 to combine into 1. So that means that the width of the city itself adds to the distance. It can be 141 and a third plus the width of the city. If that's the total space you could have between any of the 2 cities, and consider all 3 of them to be together. That's why this is okay. But if you had only 2 cities, then 141 and a third would be enough without adding the width of the city that is off to the corner that you're luminously placing between the 2 of them. So now the Gemara asks a few questions about this halacha. Rava asked Abaye, how far is that third city allowed to be from these 2 cities, and still we could luminously move them between them and consider it to be 1 city? So he said, Rava answered him, Alpayim Amma. It's up to 2,000 Ammas. So the Gemara said, hold on a second. This sounds very similar to the case we had earlier of 1 city shaped like an arch. And we had said that the distance from the roof of the arch to the legs of the arch, we had 2 opinions whether it could be 2,000 Ammas or any size. And Abaye had said that that there is no limit to how far it is from the roof of the arch to the feet of the arch. But here you're telling me that it's 2,000 Ammas, like the other opinion there. So which is it? Should be the same in the case of the 3 cities that are laid out like a triangle, and in the case of the 1 city shaped like an arch. So Gemara says that Abaye answered, he said, what do you mean? It's very different. In the case of the 1 city laid out like an arch, so you can get to the legs by walking around the entire circular length of the arch. And that's why it makes no difference how far it is from the roof of the arch to the feet of the arch, because I can get from one to the other no matter how far it is. Here, you have cities that are separate. They're separate from each other. If it's more than 2,000 apart, it's too far away. You can't consider them to be combined into 1. Okay, Rava then asked Abaye, the 2 cities that you're combining by luminously placing the third city between them, and the space from the cities, the outer cities, to the middle city is less than 141 and a third. How far apart are the 2 outer cities allowed to be from each other? So he said, what do you mean? Who cares? As long as if I place the middle city between them and the gaps are less than 141 and a third, that's okay. Why do I care how far apart they are? So he said, you sure? It makes no difference how far apart they are, b'chal, as long as, even if it's 4,000 amas apart? He said, yeah, even if it's 4,000 amas apart, who cares? He said, what do you mean? But in the case of the arched city, again, we said that the legs can't be more than 4,000 amas from each other. So how come here these 2 cities are allowed to be 4,000 amas or more from each other? So he said, it's very simple. In the case of the arched city, that space is not going to fill in. If the legs of the arch are more than 4,000 amas from each other, nothing is going to grow. The city's not going to grow and expand into that area. It's an arch-shaped city. It's going to stay shaped like an arch. Here you have 2 cities. They're spread apart from each other 4,000 amas. It'll grow. It'll fill in that space, and therefore you don't have to worry about it, and it's okay. Okay, now the Gemara says that Rav Safra said to Rava, you're telling me that you're allowed to combine the cities only if they're within a certain space from each other, either 141 and a third amos, or if there's a third city, you could add some more space. But the towns of Akistefan and Ardashir were more than this distance apart from each other, and yet in calculating Tchumen, they each counted from each other's Tchum. They consider themselves to be one combined city. How could it be? They're more than this space apart, and the Chidekel River, the Tigris, runs between them. So how did they combine themselves in Hilchos Tchumen? So he took him out and he showed him that in the river there's the legs of an ancient wall that used to be there that collapsed. But it still forms enough of a structure that counts to combine the cities, and you would count those structures as still standing things, and they count as part of the city, and that's why they combine into one big city.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.